Late. Is Biggest Dickus Maximus Gur said late. I was wise enough to unmute before I started talking today. See, Dr. K is learning. How y'all doing today? Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is just for educational and entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Thanks for the sub, Shemap. We really appreciate it. All the subs, donos, etc. We appreciate everyone's support. Helps us keep streaming and doing more in different kinds of content. So thank y'all very much. Hydrate yourselves, absolutely. Water gang, where y'all at? Out of sync here. Is that on my end? I feel like it's going fine from over here. What would you say to someone who actively avoids the streams that pertain to them? I would say don't beat yourself up about it and come around whenever you're ready. We're waiting for you. So something kind of interesting, right? So if you push people, what do? They dig their heels in. People don't like to be pushed. So I think sometimes it's a lot better to pull people in with a welcome, an open door, and a bit of a vacuum as opposed to trying to push people in. You know? Laszlo Forgax, thanks for the Prime Gaming sub. We really appreciate it. Right? So people have their pace, and we're here and ready for you whenever you're ready to join. So I'll tell you all an interesting story. So when I first started teaching, what I noticed was that all of the professors that I had would have very strict rules about technology usage, cell phone usage, etc. Because when you're in a classroom, you're supposed to be teaching, and other people are supposed to be paying attention. And so when I started teaching, I set down a couple of other rules because I thought that some of those rules were silly. Rule number one, when people sit down in class, I say, the first thing I want y'all to do is open up your laptops. Pull up your favorite website. Whether you want to shop or check ESPN or whatever. Pull up whatever you find distracting about school. What I'm going to try to do over the next 5 to 10 minutes is convince y'all that what I'm going to teach you is more interesting and worth your time, more so than whatever you're going to be distracting yourself with. So a couple of things, ground rules for my classroom. First of all, please don't do anything that's disruptive. So you can do whatever you want to. It's your time. You decide how you want to use it. If you want to be on ESPN, that's totally fine. But don't do anything on ESPN that's going to disrupt someone else who's trying to pay attention. Rule number two, if you're feeling tired, bored, distracted, etc., there's no point in sitting here and falling asleep in class. Like if it's better for you to go home and sleep for an hour so that you can be productive the rest of the day, go ahead and step out. And if y'all are feeling bored and distracted, just step outside, stretch your legs, and come back. Those are like my rules for classrooms. Because I think as a teacher, like it's the obligation is on me to try to make the content interesting. Right? But that's not how we function. We put all the responsibility on paying attention on the students, and the professors aren't given any feedback about maybe the reason that kids aren't paying attention is because your class is boring. How many failed? None that I can think of. I mean, I wasn't teaching the whole class, so I was like a guest lecturer, right? So I was responsible for some things. And it works out really well. Like attendance rates are high, people are engaged, you know? Okay, a couple of other announcements. So, Swap It Challenge. We've reached all 3 milestones, so I guess I'm doing an ASMR stream. The community swapped out 144,000 minutes. That's 100 less days of mindfulness technology usage, or mindless technology usage in the world. We saw 11,000 submissions in total, 1,000 plus participants, and the community earned 2.5 million points. Can you all believe that? 100 fewer days in our community of mindless technology usage. Strong work. So winners, Shubstez, Ruler of Wax, Leaderer, Ariano, Ines17, and Geo. So we were originally going to have 5 winners, but the difference between 5th and 6th place was only 10 points. So we expanded it to 6 winners because I guess we were feeling sorry for Geo, who I assume is number 6. I don't know. Maybe those are out of order. So keep an eye out on Friday's stream for next month's challenge. So strong work, everybody. Strong work to all the participants. And apologies to Geo if I assigned you the rank of 6th when you were actually somewhere between 1 and 5. So, oh, I see Shubsta's in chat. So people are in chat too. Congratulations, Shubstez. Yeah, strong. Serocrats. I was just scanning chat, yo. Okay. Let's get started. Yeah, I mean, because the points were like on the scale of like millions, right? Like people got 2 million points. So 10 points feels bad, man. Feels sad. Okay. Let's talk about what we're talking about today. So what we're talking about, we're going to cover hopefully 4 different things. So we have decided there are a couple things that we haven't touched on much on stream. So we're actually going to do, and it seemed like people were super into the basic, like understanding of like, okay, how do depressive episodes work? What's the deal with antidepressant medication? Can you become dependent on that stuff? So I think what we're going to try to do over the next couple of months, just to let y'all know, is we're going to try to cover like mental health 101 for a lot of actual diagnosable illnesses. So today we're going to talk a little bit about OCD, like super basic stuff about, okay, what is OCD? What do some people get wrong about it? And like, what are some common misconceptions with OCD? We're going to talk a little bit about gaming addiction from a parent's perspective. And we're going to talk a little bit about becoming dependent on ADHD medication, and specifically like, what does it mean to be dependent? Like, is that good? Is that bad? Like, it sounds like a bad thing, right? And then we're going to talk a little bit about love, because there's some interesting research. We've been doing a deep dive on relationship research recently. It's been something that the community has been really interested in. So I've read, I don't know, like maybe like 50 or 60 papers over the last month or two on, what causes people to succeed in relationships. So we're going to share a couple of basic thoughts with y'all, okay? Also, I watched Indian Matchmaking Season 2, and I don't know if y'all have seen that, but I really enjoy Indian Matchmaking. And it makes me wonder a little bit about whether we're going to see like a rise in matchmaking after, like, if dating apps continue to cause people problems. You just started season 1, Frog Johnson? Well, hopefully you enjoy it. Yeah, so like, anyway, we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to tell you all a story. Anyway, it's coming soon. All right. What are my thoughts on psychiatry versus psychology? I think they're all great. And if you want to be a medical doctor, become a psychiatrist. If you want to learn exclusively about the mind, then become a psychologist. No spoilers. No spoilers. It's on Netflix. Yeah, it's a great show. Tops. Okay. So, Obania is saying they sanitize a lot of the classism, racism, and colorism that actually happens in matchmaking. I thought they did a really good job of actually portraying that in season 1. Guru 1911 is saying, is it true that psychiatry is more a quick burst of help rather than long-term treatment? That is an excellent question. We're going to get to that today in a post. So let's get started. We have things for what everyone is talking about. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about love. So Vox recently had an article about what science still can't explain about love. And the article's like pretty interesting. We'll link it. I can't link it myself, but maybe you can just Google it. So the article talks. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about love. So Vox recently had an article called "What Science Still Can't Explain About Love," and the article's pretty good. It talks a little bit about different perspectives on love. And they sort of interviewed dating coaches, matchmakers, psychologists, and tried to get a sense of like, why haven't we figured this out yet, right? So like love, like we've got a bunch of science, we understand so much about relationships, and what's going on here? So they make a couple of major conclusions. The first is that our preferences can't always predict attraction. So that's one of the hypotheses that they state. And I'd say I kind of agree with this. That a lot of times we have preferences and we don't really, just because someone meets our preferences or checks our boxes, doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be attracted to them. And what is far more woeful is that sometimes we are actually very attracted to people who don't meet our preferences, which causes so many problems. The second thing that they sort of dig into is that, so as they're sort of talking a little bit about, okay, why can't we figure out love? They come up with a couple of theories. So the first theory is that scientists can crack the code if they look hard enough. So this is a theory that basically posits, as long as we do enough research and we crunch enough numbers, we will eventually figure out what it takes to fall in love. We'll figure out the formula or equation, like, the equation for gravity, F equals GMM over R squared, right? Like we can figure out love if we just do enough research. So that's one perspective. Another perspective is, and this is something that I personally agree with, is that love is actually chaotic by nature. So as I mentioned earlier, I've been reading a lot of papers about neuroscience of love and neuroscience of relationships and things like that. And there are actually a lot of studies that show that love is actually like a chaotic and dysregulated state in the brain. So we know that from fMRI studies, which are studies of blood flow to the brain, that when someone is in love, they start to inhibit all kinds of like useful circuitry in the brain. So our risk assessment circuitry gets inhibited when we're in love. Our executive function kind of gets messed up. Our ability to plan kind of gets messed up. There are all kinds of amplifications of particular emotional circuits and even suppression of other emotional circuits, like suppressing negative emotions while we're in the state of love. So there's actually evidence that shows that love, at least in the brain, is sort of like a pro-chaotic, pro-bad decision, not considering risk sort of state. Like it literally, we see reduced blood flow to some of our risk assessment parts of the brain. And there are even, if you look at some of the studies, they'll even sort of posit evolutionary hypotheses for this, is that there's a certain amount of stupidness that you have to induce that is sort of tips things towards procreation, right? So creating babies is like a huge energy investment, can cost people a lot. And so what we want to do is like our brain sort of handicaps us and sort of like doesn't let us really think about the consequences, which may actually be a trait that's been selected for evolutionarily over the course of millions of years. Okay, that's theory number two, some evidence of this. And the last thing that they talk a little bit about is which theory do matchmakers and relationship coaches kind of believe in. And so they talk a little bit about, how matchmakers and relationship coaches sort of function. And this is sort of what I'd like to share with y'all a little bit. So as we I'd like to just offer my perspective on this. And what I'd love to do is share with y'all almost like a story of how I came to believe what I did about love. And then also share with y'all, I think, one of the biggest mistakes that people make nowadays when approaching relationships. So this kind of starts out with my job as a psychiatrist. So one of the interesting things is that I get to see the inside of a lot of relationships. Now, people may think, oh, as a psychiatrist, if you're doing couples counseling, doesn't that mean that there's a selection bias and you get to see the inside of the worst relationships, right? Because in couples counseling, it's only like people who have problems that are going to see a psychiatrist. Whereas actually, I see a lot of relationships that are not a part of couples counseling. So just as an example, if I have a patient but there's nothing wrong with their marriage, let's say I'm treating them for ADHD, at some point, I will ask about their marriage, right? Is their marriage something that is supportive in terms of like, mental health standpoint? Oftentimes I'll meet their spouse, right? Because we'll have sort of like a kind of meet and greet and sort of make sure that we're all on the same page, see if the spouse has any concerns, if there's any kind of plans that we have to develop. So oftentimes I see the inside of a lot of really healthy relationships. And the first thing that I noticed, I made an observation when I was back in residency. I noticed something very strange, which is that the healthiest relationships almost always have at least one red flag. And I was kind of surprised by this. So I was meeting people that were like in their 40s and their 50s, and like they had really strong, healthy relationships. When I'd ask them, like, oh, when did you meet? What were things like, early on in your relationship? There was almost always like one red flag, right? So one example is, I had one patient who, I'm going to sort of make these chimerical for those of you that don't know. So I'm going to change around gender and age and ethnicity and stuff so that people can't be identified. But I had one patient who, decided to marry someone who was like unemployed and a few years older than they were. And so this was a patient who was 18 years old, decided to marry a dude 6 years older who was like unemployed at the time. And like, that seems like a terrible idea, right? You're an 18-year-old marrying a 24-year-old is a terrible idea. Furthermore, 24-year-old is like kind of unemployed, not really going anywhere. Anyway, they're happily married now, doing very, very well in terms of careers and family and stuff like that. So it's like kind of like a red flag. And the more that I saw the insider relationships, the more that I saw that like, okay, like all of these relationships ended up really good, but it sounds like they actually had relatively rocky starts. And so I was really kind of curious about that. And I was starting to think, okay, like how does this work? Like what's going on here? So I made that observation, but wasn't really sure. For what it's worth, I kind of think that my relationship also sort of had like, in a sense, a red flag or yellow flag in the sense that my wife was dating someone who told her explicitly that they were going to become a monk and be celibate and forsake the world, right? Which like seems kind of like red flag territory to me. Like, why would you date someone like that? Anyway, she was wiser and understood that I was, didn't understand what I was talking about. But my point is that on paper, like that's sort of like a red flag, right? So then I started getting curious about this. And so I started asking people from my culture. So I'm Indian, and in our culture, we have a lot of arranged marriage, or at least used to. There's still a lot of arranged marriage. And I started asking people a little bit about, okay, so like, how does this, y'all have been married for 30 years. Like, how does that work? Like, what was the arranged marriage like? And then I thought they shared with me something that was really, really interesting, which is that when they had an arranged marriage, happiness was not guaranteed, right? So when you get married in an arranged marriage, you're not sure that you're going to be happy. You kind of get married for a number of different causes, a number of different reasons that will hopefully lead to a successful and harmonious life. But happiness in and of itself, or even love for that matter, is not guaranteed. And so the interesting thing that I sort of discovered talking to a lot of people who had been in arranged marriages is that they had to work for it. So like you started this relationship with both people sort of under the impression that depending on what we put into the relationship is what we're going to get out. So whether we're happy or not sort of depends on a certain amount of my flexibility, a certain amount of like, how much I try. And it also depends on the other person being flexible and trying. And hopefully if the two of us work together, we can end up at least happy and hopefully in love. And so I thought that was like kind of a really, really interesting perspective. And so I think that's sort of when I sort of talked to, or when I went back to my, my patients and stuff who had been in love marriages with red flags, I sort of started to ask them a little bit about this kind of principle as well. And what I actually found is that in every one of those cases, there are red flags which had to be actively overcome by both parties, right? So people were sort of, in a sense, committed to the relationship, stupidly so, right? Because there's that risk assessment part of your brain that's not getting as much blood, right? So you're taking risks. But that both people were sort of, in a sense, committed to the relationship, and they recognized that like finding happiness or harmony in the relationship was like a co-op game. And so I think this is the big thing that we've lost. We've lost sort of this idea that a relationship's happiness is not, so what we think right now is that the happiness in a relationship is sort of determined by the other person. And we sort of see this, right? So if the third thing that I want to share with y'all is I talked to some people who were like on dating apps, right? So especially more recently, past 3 years, 4 years, a lot of my patients are using dating apps. And I sort of talked to them a little bit about, okay, like what's the psychology of like, help me understand why you're using a dating app. What are you looking for? And here's the way that they explain it to me. So I want to be in a long-term relationship. A long-term relationship, let's say 30 years, 40 years, I want to get married, I want to have kids, I want to go roll together, all that good stuff. Have someone in my corner. And so I kind of ask them, okay, so what determines whether you're in a long-term relationship or not? And they essentially get to, well, whether I'm happy or not, right? Because if I'm unhappy in a relationship, I'm going to leave. And if I'm happy in a relationship, I'm going to stay. And so the happier I am in the relationship, the more likely I am to stay in a relationship for 30 years. And so their goal, they were sort of equating happiness in a relationship with like long-term committal. Makes sense. So then the interesting thing is that I'd ask them, okay, so like what determines whether you're happy in a relationship? And that's when they'd sort of essentially say, well, it depends on whether I get what I want. And this is where the selectivity comes in. So essentially what's happening is you have people sort of like thinking, okay, if I get A, B, C, D, and E, if I check these 5 boxes, or if my partner checks these 5 boxes, then I will be happy in a relationship. If I'm happy in a relationship, then the relationship will last. And that's how I'm going to find a long-term relationship. And so I realized that the major mistake that people seem to be making now is that they think that happiness in a relationship is something that is found instead of something that is built. So if I'm unhappy in the relationship, and this is what we sort of see with online dating, is that like, okay, if I'm unhappy with this person, instead of working on that relationship and trying to get that person to change, or even shockingly change myself, what I'm going to do is just look for someone who checks all the boxes. So since I have, 1,000 different people that I can examine over here and see if any of those are better fits, I'm not going to invest in working on this relationship, working on myself, or trying to encourage this other person to grow and change. And so this is what is crazy, is that when I talk to people who are in successful relationships, a huge part of that is actually like them working on themselves. So it's like learning to be flexible when you don't get what you want, right? So can I be happy in spite of getting what I want? And this is where we can pull in a bunch of like excellent theory from sort of Eastern religions. So if we look at like the karmic religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, the religions that gave us meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, these kinds of things. And what they basically taught us is that a lot of our unhappiness has to do with what's in here. And actually what we sort of find is that the more that you get what you want, sometimes the more unhappy you become. So I felt this, very strongly when I was playing video games all day, because what did I want? I didn't want to go to class. I wanted to play video games all day long. And so that's what I did. And the next day I played more video games because I didn't want to go to class. I didn't want to fail the class. Can't fail the class if you don't show up to the final. I mean, you can fail the class. I guess you can't fail the final. You can fail the final as well, but it happens somewhere over there. You get a letter grade in the mail on a piece of paper that you don't even have to open, right? So a big part of what I see in relationships now is that everyone is looking for happiness instead of building it, instead of investing it, instead of being flexible. And so then I want you all to think about this. If someone is not willing to be flexible and compromise and find happiness in spite of them not getting what they want, what situation does that create? That creates, I'm going to date this person for a couple weeks. Oh, I'm unhappy. Let me find someone else. And then I find someone else. I'm a little happier for a little while, and then I start to become unhappy. Let me find someone else. Let me find someone else. Let me find someone else. And so you get people who are on dating apps for a very, very long time. And that's because they keep on looking for happiness from their partners instead of doing any kind of internal work. It's like the complete opposite of what we see in an arranged marriage. And so this is kind of the big thing that I think that we need to really understand, is that if you want to be happy in a relationship, if you want to be successful in a relationship, a lot of that doesn't have to do with checking boxes. And we actually use checking boxes as proxies of our own happiness. But if we look at theories of like Eastern wisdom or Eastern psychology, what they say is that a lot of our happiness doesn't actually have to do with fulfilling our desires. In fact, they say the opposite. And the more that you focus on fulfilling your desires, like the worse off you're going to be. So this is what I think what we're missing, is that if you're sort of dating, for you to think a little bit about, if you're unhappy in a relationship, how much of this does my partner need to change, or how much of this do I need to find the perfect partner? And how much of this is like, do I need to learn how to be happy in spite of not getting what I want? And what I tend to find in all of the successful relationships, whether they're love marriages or arranged marriages, is that it's people who are willing to be somewhat flexible with what they want and what they're willing to get and what they're willing to sacrifice or not sacrifice. It's that kind of flexibility that really is a good prognostic factor for success in relationships. And I think even when you look at all the science on that, everyone's sort of looking at relationship factors and people like, okay, did you get what you want? Did you not get what you want? You know, if you get what you want, how does that correlate with success in a relationship? And all the research says it doesn't correlate with success in a relationship. Or, I mean, that's an oversimplification, but a lot of it is not very promising that way, right? That's why we haven't figured it out yet, because when we ask people what they want, it doesn't seem to correlate very well. But what people don't ask, or there is relationship research on this, and this is what's really interesting, is when people start to ask not so much about the other person, but about you and your ability to compromise, your ability to be flexible, your ability to like really think about what you want, and are you able to prioritize your partner's happiness? And what we tend to see is it's in situations like this where partners are willing to prioritize these each other's happiness as opposed to checking all the boxes for their hypothetical perfect relationship. Those are the ones that lead to good relationship outcomes. So a lot of what we're missing in relationships is actually a lack of awareness about our own flexibility. And how much of my happiness am I willing to work on? How much am I willing to let go? How much am I willing to set boundaries? How much am I willing to support my partner in making healthy changes? It's not just, hey, I think you need to do this, so you should start, and it's all on you. It's when partners accept responsibility for each other and sort of work together towards making changes that people end up being the best. So that's kind of a quick summary on relationships and kind of my perspective. I think that, you know, I've had the privilege of looking at a lot of different relationship perspectives, both from sort of like hard science research, including brain scans, doing therapy with people who are in healthy and unhealthy relationships, and even culturally, like looking at people who are in arranged marriages versus love marriages. And what I've sort of found is that there's one thing that we're really missing, especially when it comes to online dating. And that's this idea that like whether I'm happy in a relationship or not does not just depend on whether my partner checks the boxes. It depends on my own flexibility and my own willingness to be happy in spite of not getting what I want. And the more that we move towards online dating and an overabundance of choice, the more we have this idea that, okay, if I find the perfect person, if they check all the boxes, then I will be happy. And we assume that getting what we want is what makes us happy, whereas I'm not so sure that that's the case. For the record, I'm not saying that arranged marriage is superior to love marriage, or that love marriage is superior to arranged marriage, or that there aren't arranged marriages that end very, very terribly. What I'm talking about is for all kinds of long-term relationships that I've seen, what floats to the surface in terms of determining whether that relationship is successful or not. And I think the biggest thing that we tend to miss is that we think that the success of our relationships depend on the other person. But a lot of the success of our relationships depend on us and how much we're willing to grow, how much we're willing to sacrifice, how much we're willing to put our partner ahead of ourselves. And the healthiest relationships, the longest lasting relationships, are the ones where I prioritize my partner and my partner prioritizes me. Yeah, as Focus is saying, be flexible to succeed. Questions? Great question. So SVM Potato is saying, what if you feel like you will never be good enough so you don't get into a relationship? That's exactly what I'm saying is the problem. Is that if we think about it, what like good enough is that checkbox system, right? So if we assume, okay, so like how do I end up in a successful relationship? Well, people are looking for, so if I'm someone out there, people are looking for someone who checks all the boxes. And so if I find someone who checks all the boxes, then I will be happy in a relationship and the relationship will be successful. Now let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is trying to check the boxes, right? So I want to be all these things so I can be successful in a relationship, so that people will pick me. My whole point is that people who are successful in relationships don't necessarily have to check the boxes when we start out. And that becoming a good partner is not something that, it's not like you're a finished product. It's not like you get made in the factory and then shipped out to be purchased as the perfect partner. Right? And so like, if you're like, oh, I'm not great. Like, I don't have a job. I don't, like maybe I'm short. Like maybe I'm not as physically attractive. Maybe I'm a little bit out of shape. Maybe I have an addiction that I'm dealing with, or some kind of depression, or maybe like, there's something about me that's off. So I'm not a perfect product. And this is the whole thing, is that in dating, we think about people as finished products, right? I'm going to select this person to be my mate, and they have to check all the boxes. It's like going into a store and picking up a product that has been, play tested and calibrated and refined. But that's not what human relationships are. I don't think you need to be perfect to start a relationship. In fact, I think it's that kind of thinking that screws people on both sides. Because I'm expecting perfection from my partner. You're supposed to be, I'm looking for someone who's emotionally available, financially stable, clean, has their own house, drives their own car, is financially independent. We already said that one once. Is good looking, knows how to groom themselves, is self-sufficient, can do their laundry, can cook, doesn't use any drugs, or uses the same level of drugs that I do, but doesn't use any more. Is religious, is not religious. So we're expecting perfection from our partners. And on the flip side, we have people who are like, I'm not perfect yet. What do I do? You date anyway. You acknowledge that, like, when I started dating my girlfriend, like, I had no job, no money, no net worth, shitty GPA, was planning on becoming a monk. Like, I had like 5 red flags. Like, all I had going for me was a good set of hair. And so, like, that's my point, is that when you care about someone and when your brain gets muddy up here, you start disinhibiting certain parts of your brain. You start inhibiting the more calculating parts. Like, and then you work towards it, right? You say, okay, so like you're unemployed and, you've got a crappy GPA. So like, let me help you try to build your life. And so if your life isn't entirely together, then like, you work towards it. I make one comment about hair and chat goes wild. Okay, someone's asking, what do you think about getting back together with your ex? So here's what I'd say, not knowing anything about the situation. Let's talk about exes for a second. You should only get back together with your ex if both of you are committed to working on the problems that made you exes. It's not about them having changed or you having changed. Both of y'all have to be committed to fix whatever crap caused y'all to break up in the first place. And if people are committed to that change, then it's not a bad idea, knowing nothing else about the situation. But if people aren't committed to that change, then you're in trouble. So Ami the pleb or Amy the pleb is saying, what if you feel like you don't have the capacity to help the other party? Then I don't think you're ready for a relationship. Right? So the thing about a relationship is that, remember that it's on equal footing. So let's talk about another relationship that is problematic. So sometimes we have a relationship between a broken person and a whole person. One person who's got their crap together, another person who doesn't have their crap together. So these relationships can start out very lopsided, right? Because one person is doing the caring of, and one person is being cared for. And that can be okay for some amount of time. So like I've seen those relationships actually work out, but the goal there is that, both people have to be invested in trying to take care of each other, in trying to support each other, and trying to help each other grow. But you may be asking, but if I'm the busted one, how do I help my partner grow if they have all their crap together? Well, you help your partner grow and you support them by investing heavily in yourself so that they don't have to carry all the time, right? Like, it's in recognizing that, okay, the thing that I can do the most for my partner right now is in taking care of myself and getting myself into such a place where they don't have to take care of me, where I can start taking care of them. And that's the whole point behind a relationship, is that y'all share the load, right? And so if you're not carrying your part, the best thing you can do to help your partner is to start carrying your fair share and really focus on yourself. And I think that works out great. Now, this person said, I recognize I actually kind of reversed what I was saying, but they were sort of saying, like, what if I can't take care of someone? So I would be super careful, because if you're not in that situation where you really can't take care of yourself, you could be setting yourself up for one of the many other lopsided situations that don't end well. So we shared the side that goes well, but here's what can happen a lot of time. One thing that happens is that the relationship becomes dependent, where one person is always doing the lifting and one person is always doing the receiving. Then we feel love, right? And then we feel guilt because we're not but like there's love involved, and maybe there's even like intimacy involved and stuff like that. So things get tangled. And then we get into complacency of dependence, which is very, very common. My partner never does the laundry, never does the sheets, never cleans the house, and I just do everything for them. Or my partner doesn't get a job, is home all day, is depressed, and I support them. We can fall into this like dependency relationship very, very rapidly. And then sometimes, why don't people leave those relationships? Well, it's because, I don't know if y'all get this, but people are afraid of being alone. Right? Sometimes we're in a relationship with someone who's very dependent on us, and we think that like if we don't want to give up on love, we don't want to be a bad person, we don't want to abandon them. And by the way, if we abandon them, am I ever going to find anyone? So there are all kinds of problems that end up with when we've got this kind of like imbalanced relationship. Sometimes we can also develop power dynamics. That's another reason why these relationships can go poorly, right? Because if I'm making the money and you're not making the money, then it's my way or the highway. I get to make all the decisions, and that can be sort of toxic in a relationship. So, if you're not ready to help someone else in a relationship, I think probably the best answer is to focus on yourself first and have the capacity to give, because that's what a successful relationship requires. Have the capacity to give. But you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to like check all the boxes ahead of time. That's my whole point. Is if you think about, who is going to end up in a more successful long-term relationship? So let's say scenario number one, I check all the boxes. Therefore, someone agrees to date me because I check all the boxes ahead of time. And then what happens is like, what happens if I uncheck a box in the future? And then that person is unhappy. Let's say that they want someone who's got a nice set of hair. And then I start to go bald. And now they're unhappy. What was their solution to happiness? Their solution to happiness was find the perfect partner. And as long as the partner is perfect, then I will be happy. And if partner starts to lose hair, well, now I'm unhappy. And what's my solution is find the perfect partner. So what do? Divorce. Versus someone who's more flexible with their happiness. My solution is I'm going to find someone that I really love, even if they're not perfect. And we're going to work together towards building a relationship that's healthy. And we're going to work together towards building a life that's good. Right? That's my point. Is that like, we just assume that other people checking boxes of our criteria is going to lead to a healthy relationship. And that's not a good assumption. Melon Biscuit is saying there's no such thing as the perfect partner. I completely agree with you. But just because there ain't no such thing as a perfect partner doesn't mean that people won't date you because you're not perfect. And doesn't mean that they're going to stop looking for perfect. Half the problem right now is that we've got a ton of people out there who are looking for the perfect partner who doesn't exist. But they have no problem judging people for not being perfect, and they're going to keep looking for it. And so what you see is people who are getting older and older and older on dating apps who are getting more and more and more selective. Right? So it's like I date one person, and these are my 4 criteria. And by the way, I didn't realize that my partner was a gamer. So next time around, no gamers. So now I add a 5th criteria to the list. No gamers. And then I find someone, right? Because there's 10,000 people out there. I find the one who checks all 4 of the criteria and isn't a gamer. Turns out they have an alcohol problem. Okay, so like no alcoholics next time around. And so the list keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. The more failed relationships that I have, the more I expect from other people. Whereas the problem's in here. The problem is when I'm dating a gamer, I don't sit down and deal with them in a compassionate way, set healthy boundaries, and like work towards like, you know, building a life where we're both happy with what we've got. Get it? Okay. Should we move on? I only date gamers. Yeah, so that's where it's like, you know. But Sage X is saying, but it's not my responsibility to fix them. So this is, I think, where we get, I know it's going to sound kind of weird, but like, this is where I think once you're in a committed relationship, it's shared responsibility. So I think this is part of the issue is that it's not your responsibility to fix them entirely. They've got to help you. And we'll talk about that in a second too, when we talk about parenting and addiction. But I think that part of the problem is that when it comes to committed relationships, when each person in the relationship dumps the responsibility on the other person. Whereas like the good relationships that I've seen are the ones where there's shared responsibility. Now, shared responsibility doesn't mean solo responsibility, right? So if like I have a partner who has an addiction problem or mental health problem, like I can be as supportive as I want to, but they have to take responsibility too. Does loyalty define love or the other way around? Two are completely independent. Love and loyalty are just like completely different things. In my opinion, anyway. Okay, so Warm Lava Zero is asking a great question. Is it healthy to care about your partner more than you care about yourself? What if they don't do that back, what you do? That's when there's a problem. So here's the scenarios. I prioritize my partner over myself versus I prioritize myself over my partner. And what do they prioritize? So sometimes we'll get stable relationships where I care more about my partner and they care more about themselves. So I put them number one, they put themselves number one. And then sometimes that relationship can be stable. Is it going to be happy? I don't think so. Option number two is I put them number one, they put me number one. That's a good relationship. When there's reciprocity and you care about the other person more than you care about yourself. Third option is that I care about myself first, partner cares about puts themselves first. That can also be a stable relationship. I've seen these kinds of relationships where it's almost like a business transaction where we're going to stay in this relationship as long as it benefits me. And there's a certain amount of like transactional nature to that. And sometimes that's not okay, right? Where people are like, I'm going to put myself first, you're going to put yourself first. So let's just part ways because this isn't working for me anymore. So all three are options. And then the other, we kind of, it's all reasonable. But I think when you prioritize your partner and they don't prioritize you, that's not a sustainable, happy relationship. I personally think the healthiest way is for you to put the other person first and for the other person to put you first. Do you think that when people are too invested in their partner, they cannot give the other person any space? I would not call it, so I don't know what you mean by too invested. But what I've seen, so in a nutshell, why do partners have difficulty giving space to their partner, right? So why do people have difficulty giving space to their partner? The simplest reason is because when you meet your emotional needs that are independent of the relationship, through the relationship, that's when you don't give your partner space. Why don't we give our partner space? Because I am getting something out of this relationship. I need my partner to fulfill a core need that I have that has nothing to do with the relationship. So simple example, if I'm lonely, so there's a certain amount of companionship that all relationships come with. But if I'm so lonely and I have no other social connections in the world and I'm relying on my partner for every single one of my social relationships, They're my friend, my best friend, my husband, my wife, my drinking buddy, my gaming partner. When all of my social, sometimes even my parent, they do my laundry for me. When we rely on our partners to fulfill needs outside of what is a relationship need, that's when we stop giving partners space. Because I need you for entertainment to make the loneliness go away. I need you to help me get out of bed because I suffer from depression. You become my crutch. And the more dependent that you become on your partner for meeting needs outside of relationship needs, the more problematic it becomes. Oftentimes we don't realize that, right? It's because I love you and you love me. So anytime I'm lonely, that's something that I can lean on you for. And if I don't feel confident in myself, one thing that makes that go away is when you compliment me. And then what happens is I become dependent on your compliments for my sense of self-worth, and I don't work on myself independently. And then the partner feels suffocated because any day in which they're not complimenting my appearance, like I feel like they're not being a good partner. And they're like, oh my God, like, because now you're sort of making them responsible for your feelings. Why do some people get attached to abusive partners? So Brother Bruja is asking why some people, usually girls, get attached to abusive partners. Personally, I'm guessing it has something to do with self-pity. Is that Stockholm Syndrome in a way? I wouldn't agree that there's a gender dynamic in terms of who ends up with an abusive partner. I mean, maybe there's data behind it. I haven't looked at it. So I wouldn't make an assumption that it's usually girls, first of all. Second thing is, why do people end up attached to abusive partners? So a couple of reasons. Number one reason is that the abusive partner makes you feel the way that you do about yourself already. So they confirm how you feel about yourself. So if I think that I'm worthless and an abusive partner makes me feel worthless, then that fits. Interestingly enough, when you have someone who's been through a lot of trauma or bullying or things like that, and they have lost a fundamental sense of value in themselves, and then they start dating someone who cares about them as a person. And what do I mean about cares about them as a person? It means that my caring for you does not depend upon particular behaviors. So you're allowed to make a mistake and I care about you anyway. People who are in that relationship actually get scared. They're like, what is going on here? Like, the idea that my partner can care about me as a person is bewildering. And actually what happens is sometimes people who are in those relationships, if you have very low self-esteem and you're in a relationship with someone who cares about you as a person, you'll actually be afraid of the relationship and sometimes will even incite your partner to break up with you. Because in their head, what are you thinking? I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. There's no way. This is too good to be true. Because the truth is that I'm worthless. Why is this person treating me like I have worth? Where's the other shoe? They just don't know me yet. They don't understand. And so interestingly enough, people who have low self-esteem will leave healthy relationships. And the second they get into an abusive relationship, this is a game I've played before. I know this game. I can handle this. So challenging. Okay, this is turning into lots of relationship questions, but is Elden Ring an abusive relationship? Which relationship are you talking about? 2 fingers with what? 3 fingers with what? Okay. Avi B1 is asking a question. Everyone around me calls every behavior OCD. Can you help define what OCD is? Yes. Let's talk about OCD. Oh my God, it's so bright. Okay. Let's talk for a second about OCD. Let me get some water. Maybe we will need a iPad for this one. What do you think? Want to do iPad? One moment, chat. Okay. Let's see. Give me a second, chat. I've got to pull this up. Okay. So we've got this in case we need it, okay? Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk a little bit about OCD. So we're going to talk a little bit about what OCD is, what it isn't, what are some of the key features of OCD, and lastly, we're going to talk about 3 things that people get wrong when it comes to OCD. So let's start by taking a quick look at the post. Okay. OCD is the most misunderstood mental illness. Every single person I've seen thinks it's about organizing and always joking they have it because they're clean and organized. They don't understand that there's many types of OCD. And for most people, it's not like that at all. That's sometimes a coping method for some. I've convinced myself I have cancer. Someone's going to break in and hurt my pets. And I have to make sure it's not happening and keep on checking. The checking compulsions have also ruined my life. They're as bad as, if not worse, than the obsessive thoughts. Every mistake I make haunts me, and even when it affected no one. Even if it's a small mistake like accidentally stepping on something, the guilt eats me up. It hurts me so much. I want to change my whole life. I can't live like this. I've convinced myself I have every cancer before. I convince myself I have something or am something new so often. I research about it nonstop and it matches my symptoms and then it's a whole cycle. I can't take it. The fact that it's so misunderstood makes it worse. I get so pissed when people constantly say how it blessed them or I have OCD because I'm organized. Even teachers say that. Shame on them. And they haven't been diagnosed and say that. Like, shut up, seriously. So I think it's super challenging, but OCD is actually one of the most misunderstood illnesses. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about why it's misunderstood, talk a little bit about what it is, and then 3 really common mistakes that people make. So let's start with why it's misunderstood. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is OCD versus OCPD. So OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder and OCPD is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now, what's the difference between these 2 things? So we tend to use the phrase OCD colloquially. We'll say, oh my God, I'm so OCD, I have to have everything in the right place. I'm so OCD, everything has to be organized. I'm so OCD, everything has to be on time. And when people are talking about OCD, what they basically mean is I'm a control freak, right? I need everything organized, I need everything symmetrical. But being a control freak isn't OCD. It's actually something completely different, which is what we tend to call OCPD, which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So in the case of OCPD, people are control freaks to the extent where it actually negatively impacts their function and their relationships, usually to a drastic extent. If people are talking about being so OCD on social media because they have to arrange all their bookshelves in a particular way, chances are they're not actually true OCPD. I mean, very few, a small percentage of the population, maybe 1 or 2% of the population really has OCPD. So what people tend to, usually what that means is that they have a high tendency for organization, they're more rigid, they're lower on sort of the openness or lower on the agreeableness scale from a personality perspective. And everyone calls this OCD. And so as we've started calling basically being a control freak or being like more rigid in our thinking OCD, what it started to do is actually confuse a lot of people about what real OCD is. So let's talk a little bit about what true OCD is. So the first thing to understand is that OCD is composed of 2 things, obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions are usually thoughts that have the following characteristics. The first is that they're intrusive. So what that means is that I can be going about my day and then a thought will like force its way into my head. Frequently, the intrusive thoughts are also unwanted. So that sort of means I don't want to be thinking about this, right? So if I'm going to a wedding and I'm having a good time and I'm there at the wedding to have fun, But if I have OCD, I can start thinking all these sort of negative and intrusive and unwanted things. I may start thinking, oh my God, what if the groom dies? 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 Or I may start thinking a little bit about getting infected with COVID, and then I can't stop those kinds of thoughts. Or I can even eat a piece of, like, I can eat an appetizer and I get a weird sensation in my stomach, and I get this persistent thought that maybe I've got stomach cancer. So that's the third quality of obsessions, which is that they're persistent. So no matter what I do, they always tend to come back. So in the cases of people who have, for example, like, let's say body dysmorphia, which is a kind of OCD, I'll look at my face and I'll think, oh my God, my face is flawed. I need to fix it. And then no matter how much I try to fix it, even to the extent of maybe wearing makeup or going and getting surgery, and then I need more surgeries and more surgeries and more surgeries, because the key thing about the obsession from OCD is that it's persistent. And even fixing things on the outside doesn't make the thoughts go away. So obsessions are intrusive, unwanted, and persistent. The other thing about obsessions, and this is kind of important to understand, is that they don't make me happy. So even though I may act in accordance with them, it's not like making me happy to give in to my OCD. In fact, quite the opposite, frequently for many people, is that I want the thoughts to go away. I don't like it. And if we look at people who are control freaks, they get really, really happy when everyone listens to them and they get their way, right? So this is a key difference between OCD and OCPD. In psychiatry, we call this phrase ego syntonic, which basically means, does it jive with you or not? And in the case of OCD, when people have true OCD, they want their OCD to go away. When people have OCPD, they don't want their OCPD to go away because they're right and the rest of the world is wrong. And the rest of the world really needs to do things the way that I do them. We really need to objectively organize the knives, the forks, and the spoons this way because it's better. So in OCD, people really dislike the thoughts they have. They dislike the obsessions. And in OCPD, they tend to be like very, very controlling, and they think that they're good and better than what everyone else thinks. So just for the sake of completeness, oftentimes obsessions focus on a couple of different things. So they can focus on things like cleaning, or being concerned about germs, or kind of being a germaphobe or neat freak or something like that. They can be focused on symmetry, and this is where things get a little bit conflicting with OCPD, or muddy, I should say, with OCPD, because oftentimes OCPD can be people can be rigid and organized as well. So obsessions are frequently about cleaning. They're frequently about symmetry, right? So I need things arranged in a particular way. They're also frequently about what we call taboo thoughts. So people will have intrusive and unwanted thoughts that are very, very like negative. Like we judge them very harshly. So people can have thoughts about inappropriate kind of sexual relationships. They can have just all kinds of thoughts that they feel guilty for. So they're very taboo or forbidden. And the last common type of OCPD actually has to do with intrusive thoughts of harm. So this can be actually incredibly distressing because despite not wanting to hurt anyone, you will sometimes have visions of harming other people in particular ways. And those visions are, once again, intrusive, unwanted. They don't agree with you. You don't think they're right. And they can be very, very distressing. So that's obsessions, which are intrusive, unwanted, and persistent thoughts. The other key thing about OCD is that frequently what people will discover is ways to calm those obsessions down. So if I'm having a particular taboo thought, right, I'm thinking something that I shouldn't be thinking, what people with OCPD will discover is ways to alleviate the tension in the mind. And those are what we call compulsions. So if, for example, I'm a germaphobe, if I wash my hands for 90 seconds under scaldingly hot water, then my fear of germs will calm down. And so I'll engage in a compulsive behavior. So here are the key things about compulsions. They're oftentimes behaviors, but they can also sometimes be thoughts. So sometimes I've met people with OCD who will like think particular things. So I was working with someone who once, every time a loved one was traveling, they had to say some kind of like magical spell in their mind. And if they said these thoughts, this person is going to leave on time and they'll arrive on time. They'll leave. They'll be safe when they leave, and they'll be safe when they arrive. They'll be alive when they leave, and they'll be alive when they arrive. They'll sort of come up with this almost like mantra in their head that they sort of have to say in order to feel better about that person actually leaving. And unless they go through the compulsion, the tension of the obsessive thought actually persists, and it's actually incredibly terrifying. So compulsions are behaviors or even mental behaviors that we do to alleviate the obsessions. The other tricky thing about the compulsions is that they will also oftentimes be damaging in and of themselves. So in the case of the germaphobe, that's something that we can understand. I've seen patients who have, very like raw hands that are actually getting infected because they've broken down parts of the skin from excessive washing and excessive scrubbing, and now they're prone to infection, which makes the OCD even worse, and they want to keep washing and keep washing and keep washing. So engaging in the compulsions can actually be damaging to people. So that's kind of what true OCD is. We see it's a huge impairment of function. So what are some of the common things that people get wrong when it comes to OCD? The first we've already talked about a fair amount, which is that people confuse OCD with OCPD. They confuse being a control freak with OCD. But what we learn from real OCD is that it's obsessions that are intrusive, persistent, and unwanted, and compulsions that make that kind of stuff go away, even though you don't want to do it. And oftentimes people recognize that the compulsions are actually very irrational. So that's the first thing. OCD isn't what people think it is. The second thing that people oftentimes forget about OCD is that the compulsions don't have to be what the media represents. The compulsions don't have to be turning on and off the lights or turning on and off the stove. The compulsions can be completely non-visible or even not behaviors at all. They can be thoughts. They can be things that you do in your head. And when I've worked with some people who have debilitating OCD, you would never see it from the outside. Because essentially every time they do something, they have to run through this whole litany in their head. So every time I start studying, I have to go through some kind of like process in my head before I pull a single notebook out. Every time I flip the page, I have to go through some sort of process in my head before I can flip the page. Otherwise, I will lose kind of the information in the page. And the last thing that we have to really focus on that people don't really get about OCD is that you can't really control it. So this is for people who have OCD as well as people who are in relationships with people who have OCD, which is that we'll assume that this person can somehow control it. So sometimes I've seen people with OCD get treated very, very harshly by parents, by friends, by romantic partners, because they're like, why can't you just stop doing it? There's this assumption that OCD can be controlled, and it really can't. It's like this automatic, persistent, unwanted, and intrusive process that it doesn't mean that it can't be treated, but there's sort of this idea that like if people tried harder, they could make the OCD go away. Just don't wash your hands. Easy, right? Just be satisfied in the way that you look and stop getting surgeries and getting your nose, like getting a rhinoplasty and Botox injections and all this kind of stuff. Some of the most terrible OCD I've actually worked with is actually with people who are bodybuilders and who are so obsessional about a particular part of their body that they'll work out for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours a day and aren't really able to function in other parts of their life. So these are the three things that people really get wrong with OCD, which is why it makes it such a misunderstood illness. The first is that having OCD is not being a control freak. In fact, they're completely different. Even when being a control freak rises to the level of a diagnosis, which is what we call OCPD, that's still very, very rare. Second thing is that obsessions and compulsions are not necessarily physical behaviors. A lot of OCD can happen purely in your head. And the third thing is it's not something that you can just control. And so a lot of times when I work with patients with OCD, they recognize that these thoughts are unwanted. Remember, they're ego dystonic, so I don't want to have them. It doesn't make me happy to have these thoughts. And so I try to control it, I try to use willpower, but that's not how it works. There are absolutely places where willpower becomes important, but that's where good OCD treatment comes in, because we figured out that this can actually be helped. You just have to approach it in sort of an evidence-based and scientifically valid way, which is not brute forcing it through willpower or blaming someone for having these kinds of symptoms. So it's unfortunate that OCD is so misunderstood, and hopefully by sort of going over some of the basics of obsessions and compulsions, we can understand really what it is and also understand what we get wrong about it. Questions? Yeah, I didn't think we needed iPad. We may bust it out, but So a lot of good questions here. Could it be possible that having OCD is beneficial in some way? Possibly. But remember that when we're doing the dividing line between whether something is a psychiatric illness or not, the dividing line is whether it impairs function. So generally speaking, when we talk about OCD, these are people for whom it is so severe that it kind of by definition impairs them more than it helps them. Are there levels of OCPD? Absolutely, right? So just like any other personality disorder, there are people with severe OCPD and people with mild OCPD. And there are even people with what I would call subclinical OCPD. So these are people who are like control freaks, who have trouble in their interpersonal relationships, but they're not such bad control freaks that they can't maintain a job, they can maintain a healthy, or they can maintain, a romantic relationship, etc. Can OCD worsen anxiety disorders if you have both? Absolutely. So there's actually a high level of comorbidity between anxiety disorders and OCD. So it seems to be that like it's not a purely independent process. What about the compulsion to smoke cigarettes? So great question. So we can have behaviors that are compulsive, which don't necessarily have to do with OCD. So if I feel like I need to smoke a cigarette, that could be due to a biological or physiological dependence that's making me kind of feel that way. That's part of the reason that when I talk about compulsions and OCD, what we really look for, this is somewhat of an oversimplification because, if you really want to understand what we look for, you got to go to medical school and then become a psychiatrist or psychologist or whatever. But basically what we look for is that the compulsion relieves the mental tension of the obsession. This is a key part of OCD. That the reason that I wash my hands over and over and over and over again is because it's the only way that I can stop worrying about being infected. Because the thoughts of being infected are so intrusive, so persistent, and so unwanted that I can't do anything. I can't play video games. I can't talk to people. I can't pay attention in class because I'm constantly thinking about, oh my God, germs. And the only way that I can start to live life is by washing my hands 15 times so that thought finally calms down. The problem is that it's just going to come back. Tomorrow, later today, if someone touches me, it just comes back and then the cycle repeats itself, which is why OCD is so debilitating. Good questions. How easy is it to diagnose? I'd say it's not hard to diagnose if you're a competent clinician, for the most part. Sometimes the tricky thing about OCD is that it can look like other things, and also patients are, the reason we're educating on this, y'all on this stuff is because a lot of times what will happen is that patients will not volunteer particular information because they think it's normal or they don't think it's what their vision of OCD is. So that's why, for example, like I've met some patients who the diagnosis has been missed because, in the screening, clinicians will ask them questions like, oh, do you have checking behaviors? They'll talk about behaviors of OCD, whereas they won't ask about mental compulsions. So sometimes it can be missed. It can oftentimes look like anxiety or things like that. Or since people have OCD and anxiety, the anxiety is like what we pick up first, right? So there are like reasons why it can be missed, but generally speaking, I wouldn't say it's hard to diagnose. Are OCD and OCPD mutually exclusive? No, they're not mutually exclusive, but they still look very, very different. People are asking about ADHD and OCD. I don't know that there is a very tight comorbidity between the two. What I've seen is very, very frustrating for people who have OCD and ADHD. This is devastating, is that in ADHD, it's easy to get distracted, and OCD loves to dominate your mind. So what I've seen in the two, which can be very hard to deal with, is when I've got OCD and ADHD, let's say I wash my hands 10 times, and then I'm sitting down to study, and I'm no longer thinking about germs. The problem is that once I sit down to study, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe an hour goes by, maybe 90 minutes go by, maybe 3 hours go by before I think about drugs again in a neurotypical person. When you throw ADHD into the mix, it's easier to get distracted, right? So now that I get distracted, the OCD is like, oh, thank you for opening the door. Let me come in with my intrusive, unwanted, and persistent thoughts, and let's go back to square one. So sometimes I can see the two really kind of synergize in a very negative way, but I haven't seen a lot of data that shows that they're very highly comorbid. Good questions. Can people be obsessive over self-improvement? Sure. So this is also where obsessiveness is not exclusively OCD. The key thing about obsessiveness is that it usually has obsessions and compulsions. So we'll see obsessiveness as a quality that is a part of all kinds of things. So it can also be a part of other mental illnesses. So for example, like people on the autism spectrum can sometimes be obsessive about particular things. That's something that we call more something like perseverance, which is the inability to let go of a particular thought. Sometimes we'll also see obsessiveness in things like psychotic disorders or delusional disorders, right? Where someone becomes like very like delusionally obsessed with something and they can't stop thinking about it, can't stop talking about it. But it doesn't mean that you have OCD. The other thing is that sometimes obsessiveness has nothing to do with a psychiatric illness. Sometimes people just get obsessed, and it can be almost more of a personality characteristic where they really tunnel down into one thing, or they can sort of foster a certain kind of infatuation or things like that, where you may be able to diagnose someone who is like, you know, a stalker with something, right? Because there's something not right there. But sometimes you can have obsession outside of psychiatric illness. So if this resonates with y'all, so I'm noticing one person is saying, I count all the time. How can I stop? I can control a few things and started fighting against a few things. I would say you should get clinically evaluated. That's what the reason that we have these kinds of educational segments. So Brian Gu is asking, in private spaces, I'm a mess, but in public spaces, I have to leave things exactly as before I displace them. Is this OCD? So that's not a question that I can answer. So just a couple of things. When we say we're not doing, none of this is medical advice. We don't diagnose or treat people over the internet. But it's not just that we're not doing that for medical legal reasons. It's because getting a diagnosis and determining whether something is OCD involves a thorough diagnostic process. So when I'm evaluating someone for OCD, it's not a yes or no question about one feature. That's where, because remember, OCD can look like other things. And that's why when you do a diagnostic evaluation for OCD, a part of that diagnostic process is actually ruling out all kinds of other stuff. So before I can diagnose someone with OCD, I have to not only assess the OCD symptoms, but also make sure that it's not something that looks like OCD. So make sure it's not an anxiety disorder. Make sure it's not body dysmorphia. Make sure it's not, for example, bullying. Like if you were, grew up in a household, for example, where your parents were like, made sure everything was in order because you all had to keep up appearances. And so if you go out, you have to keep everything neat and tidy because of, what your parents, the way they raised you. That may not be OCD. So a diagnostic evaluation is not just about checking boxes. It's also about making sure that it's not something else. So diagnostic evaluation involves diagnostic criteria as well as assessing for other conditions and ruling out those conditions. That's how you make a real, medical diagnosis. So does OCD act in similar ways to Tourette syndrome? There are some correlations there. In fact, I think some of these tic disorders are considered in the OCD family. So I'm not an expert in those disorders, but there's definitely some overlap there or some common starting point according to a lot of people. So we do tend to lump them together. Like we kind of say, okay, these things seem similar to us. So it seems like a lot of people okay, so let me ask y'all a question now. So, someone's asking, can someone suddenly develop OCD, OCPD later in their lives, like in their 30s? They can. So just to give y'all some statistics, I want to say that the average age of onset for OCD, I'm rusty here, is I think 19 years old. So most people who have OCD will experience it early in life. Now, they may not get diagnosed with it, but I've certainly seen like weird cases. So this is the advantage of training at a place like Massachusetts General Hospital or McLean Hospital. So these are like world-renowned institutions, and people will like get referred from all over the world. So sometimes you see some weird stuff. So I've seen like weird cases of post-infectious like development of OCD. But just because I've seen it doesn't mean it's common. In fact, when you work at a place like MGH or McLean, by definition, you see a lot of stuff that is the least common because like people, it's not run-of-the-mill OCD. This is a weird kind of OCD. So like your community psychiatrist will actually send them from a different state to the OCDI at McLean, the OCD Institute at McLean Hospital, because that's where like people are experts in OCD. So you can see it later, but it's not common. Yeah, it's kind of weird. So like I love training there, but it's like I also saw, I think, a case of familial fatal insomnia, which is fascinating, but also like exceedingly rare. Like I'll probably never see another case of it in my lifetime, and I doubt, most psychiatrists will never see a case of familial fatal insomnia, hopefully. Yeah, familial fatal insomnia is a prion disease. We've done a lecture on it before. Actually, this is kind of interesting. We did a playthrough of, we started playing Disco Elysium, and there was some guy who was talking, just in some dialogue thing, and I was like, oh, this sounds like familial fatal insomnia. And then we did like a quick lecture on it, and then sure enough, like later on in the dialogue, he's like actually mentioned it. And I was like, oh, wow, these people really did their research. Once you get diagnosed with OCD, do you have it forever or can it dissipate over time? What a great question. So this we actually have another post about. So we're going to talk about general treatments for psychiatric stuff. We're going to focus a little bit on ADHD for a second, but a lot of this applies to... No iPad. We don't need Netflix. My iPad is trying to open Netflix. Okay. So let's talk about... So people have some questions about treatments, right? So short answer is there are all kinds of treatments for OCD. Medication. There are medication treatments, psychotherapy treatments. The two are not mutually exclusive. I've seen cases where people can end up in sustained remission from OCD. It basically does not affect them at all. That's the goal of psychiatric treatment. It doesn't mean that they don't still sometimes have intrusive thoughts, but they're basically able to function completely normally, and it doesn't really cause them much distress. Some of those people can do it without medication. Some people sort of find medication to be easier. It just depends on the person. But let's talk a little bit more about treatment. Okay? My doctor just told me I've become dependent on ADHD medication. What does that even mean? I got off the phone with my doctor just now to get my Adderall prescription refilled. During the call, he asked me, do you take it every day or as needed? So I told him honestly, I take it every day because I feel I need it every day. My ADHD doesn't just vanish, but on the odd day that I forget to take it, I do just fine. It's when I forget for multiple days that it becomes an issue. And he said, it sounds to me like you've become dependent on stimulants. Okay. So I told him that I actually was planning on visiting a proper psychiatrist. My prescription was given by a GP, and seeing about altering my prescription. Maybe a non-stimulant would work or a lower dosage. And he replied, no, stimulants work best for ADHD symptoms. So now I'm very confused as to what he's going on about, to be honest. I shouldn't take my medication if I don't need it because I'll become dependent on stimulants, but I also need to take stimulants because it helps me the most, therefore making me dependent. It's really confusing logic, and I don't know how I feel about it. He didn't really elaborate either. No concerns about my blood pressure or anything. He just said, hey, you're dependent, just letting you know your prescription is ready for you to pick up. It's just really confusing, and I'm paranoid about my health as it stands. So this is really tough, because especially if you've got ADHD, like anyone who's taking psychiatric medication usually has a concern that they're going to become dependent on it. I've seen this whether people have OCD, whether they have major depressive disorder, whether they have bipolar disorder, whether they have ADHD. People are afraid of becoming dependent on medication. And then sometimes you'll have clinicians who will be like, oh yeah, you're dependent on this medication now. Like a doctor is telling you this. And that's kind of terrifying. Like, isn't dependency on medication like a bad thing? And then you're like not really sure. And sometimes you'll even ask your doctor, like, hey, like, is there some way to get off the medication? And they'll say like, no, this is the most effective treatment. So I disagree with a lot of what this GP says. I'm pretty sure the evidence backs me up better than it backs the GP up. We'll talk about that for a second. But what I'd love to do is talk to y'all today about what medication dependence means. Is it okay? Is it not okay? And how people wind up being dependent on medication. And is that scary? So the first thing to understand is that the reason we prescribe medication is to sustainably help people, right? So I'm going to ask y'all a question. Let's say I have a heart transplant. And as part of my heart transplant, I have to take immunosuppressive medication every single day. Why do I have to take immunosuppressive medication? So let's do a quick jaunt into physiology and transplant rejection. Not what y'all were expecting today, but let's explain this principle. So I have a body. My body has an immune system. My immune system learns what is me and what is not me. And then what the immune system does is starts to attack things that are not me, right? Pretty easy. Turns out that I got a bum ticker and I need a heart transplant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a heart transplant. And in order for my immune system to not destroy the transplanted heart because it comes from another person, I have to take immunosuppressive medication. Now, this begs the question, am I now dependent on immunosuppressive medication? Like, sort of, right? I'm not, I guess I could stop taking it. It's just that, so this is the key thing to understand. Medication is there to accomplish a particular goal. That's really the beginning and the end of it, right? We'll add a little bit of nuance in a second. But in terms of like whether you're going to become quote unquote dependent on a particular psychiatric medication, the first question is it doing what it's supposed to do? And do you want it to continue doing what it's supposed to do? So when people take an antidepressant medication or anti-anxiety medication, for example, they're like, do I have to be on this the rest of my life? That's usually like one of the earliest questions they ask. And the short answer is you don't have to be, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is where I'd say the purpose of medication, whether it's cholesterol medication, immunosuppressive medication, weight loss medication, or ADHD medication or depression medication, the goal is the same. It's to try to keep you healthy. Now, just like with many of those medications, if you do particular things as a patient, you will no longer need the medication to do that job for you. So let's say I have type 2 diabetes, which means that due to the number of adipocytes or fat cells that I have in my body, this is an oversimplification, my body has become resistant to insulin. And so since it's resistant to insulin, I can take certain medications that will increase my insulin sensitivity, fix the problem. And what I can also do is adjust my diet, reduce the level of my adipocytes, right? Start to exercise and do other kinds of physiologic things that make it so that I no longer need the medication. So am I going to be dependent on this medication for the rest of my life? Well, that depends on my other behaviors and what else I do. So let's talk a little bit about ADHD medication. So do people become dependent on it? So some people with ADHD require medication on a daily basis. Generally speaking, stimulant medication for most people that are prescribed for ADHD, I will actually recommend it on a daily basis. So the goal with people with ADHD is, generally speaking, the ADHD kind of screws up their life, right? If I go to work every day and I need to pay attention every day, I don't want to be like missing some days and be like okay other days. Like if I show up 3 hours late to work once a month because I didn't take my ADHD medication every single day, like I'm going to lose my job. So what I found as a psychiatrist working with people with ADHD is you can't afford to have ADHD, 20% of the time. Like you can't treat 80% of it. You're still going to get screwed if you if your ADHD is like active 20% of the time. There are some cases where, for example, like if people don't need it for work, what they'll do is they'll like not take their ADHD medication on the weekends or things like that. There are individual plans that you can kind of come up with, but it's okay to take ADHD medication every single day. Does that build dependence? Oh, before we go on, so people are asking about weekends. So like, here's the thing. Sometimes you need your ADHD medication on the weekend as well. Why? Because you have to do all the crap that you don't get to do during the week on the weekend. Like you got to do laundry, you got to pick up groceries, you got to drop off packages to return to Amazon. You got to, pick up birthday cards. You got to be on time to social events. So it's fine to use my ADHD medication every single day. So does that mean you become dependent? Well, there's two issues to consider with ADHD medication. The first is that there may be a physiologic dependence. So this is neither good nor bad. It's not a value judgment. It just means that if your body develops a physiologic tolerance and dependence on a particular chemical substance, that means if you don't take it, you're going to have withdrawal symptoms, and that could be bad. So we develop different kinds of, symptoms with ADHD, different kinds of tolerance with ADHD medications. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that you need to be aware of almost from a safety standpoint. So that's where like we can become dependent on caffeine. Does that mean that morally we're bad people and we're addicts? Not necessarily. It just means that if you don't have caffeine, you may have a headache. That's it. It's just to understand the physiology of it. Now, the second thing about dependence is, do I have to take this medication for the rest of my life? That's what basically people are asking when they're saying, am I dependent on this medication? And that's where that depends. It depends. And then you may say, well, Dr. K, that's weird. Like, how can you say that depends? What does it depend on? Just like any other medical illness, or not any, but many other medical illnesses, how long you need to be on medication, the dose of the medication, that all depends on what else you are willing to do as a patient. So let's go back to our diabetes example. If I start exercising every day, if I eat low glycemic index foods, if I start, doing other particular things like doing yoga or other practices that support type 2 diabetes and stuff like that, then I may not need to be on the medication for the rest of my life, right? So if I can get to where I need to go without the medication, then I won't be dependent on the medication. I won't need it. So the question is, okay, what does that mean for ADHD? What's the equivalent of eating healthy and exercising for ADHD? First of all, eating healthy and exercising both do help ADHD. We go into some of that stuff in the guide that we've got hopefully coming out in about a month on ADHD. So we'll go over a lot of different treatment options and stuff like that in more detail. The key thing to remember about ADHD, let's talk about science, okay? What does the evidence-based data suggest? So first thing that evidence-based data suggests is that medication and psychotherapy are equally effective, roughly, in terms of effect size. What does that mean? That means that if I have 100 people with ADHD and I put 50 of them into psychotherapy and 50 of them into medication, or give them medication, the symptom reduction that they get in terms of ADHD is the same, okay? You don't need a pill. You can just go to therapy and you will get roughly the same effect size. Now, people may ask, how do you get therapy for ADHD? It gets complicated. There's also a bunch of info on this in the guide, but basically a lot of the psychotherapy for ADHD is developing structures and systems to account for your ADHD, essentially putting up guardrails so that your ADHD does not negatively impact your life. It is literally teaching people things like how to organize, how to prioritize, how to set alarms, how to set reminders. We go into a lot of detail about how to develop a good organizational system in the guide. But it teaches people these kinds of skills. And so just like any other psychiatric illness, there are certain skills you can learn that will mitigate or prevent the illness from harming you. So a simple example of that is anxiety and meditation. So if I have an anxiety disorder and I'm feeling very anxious and I learn to meditate, that can reduce the symptoms of anxiety and reduce my quote unquote dependence on anxiety medication. ADHD is no different. We can learn particular skills. That's what psychotherapy teaches us. Now, here's where the data gets interesting. So when you take people who have been given psychotherapy and people who have been given ADHD medication, effect size is roughly the same. Difference is duration of benefit after ending treatment. Here's where the dependence comes in. So when I take ADHD medication, if I stop the ADHD medication, I'm more likely to go back to square one. Whereas the cool thing about psychotherapy is if I do psychotherapy for, let's say, 20 weeks, and I'm done seeing my psychotherapist, I will still get the benefit of that therapy for a year, 2 years, maybe even 3 years, or even somewhat quote unquote permanently. Depends on the person. But what we know is that the benefits of ADHD medication even last after you've done taking the medication. So people will still get positive benefits for 6 months, 9 months after stopping medication. So their symptoms don't return back to normal right away necessarily over long, large populations and longitudinal studies. So the duration of psychotherapy far outweighs the duration of medication, which is an important consideration. So when people ask me, am I going to be on medication for the rest of my life? It's like, well, that depends on whether you develop an organizational system that will protect you from your ADHD. And if you can learn how to organize, if you can learn how to prioritize, if you learn all these things, chances are you don't need medication. Next point. So the GP said stimulant medication works the best. Oh. So there's something really tricky about stimulant medication, which is not necessarily that it works the best. So there are head-to-head studies that show that non-stimulant medications and stimulant medications basically work the same in terms of the effect size. The big difference between stimulant and non-stimulant medication is, first of all, stimulants work faster than non-stimulants. So there's a medication called bupropion, for example, that is just about as effective as stimulants. The difference is that bupropion takes like a month to really kick in, whereas stimulants, you'll feel the benefit within 24, 48, or 72 hours. So stimulants are better in terms of acting fast, but they don't necessarily work. They don't reduce your ADHD symptoms more than non-stimulant medications on the whole. The second thing about stimulants that makes them feel like they work the best, and I'm not surprised to hear that from a GP, is that patients think they work the best. So there's a very simple principle in our brain that the more rapid the reinforcement, the more behavioral reinforcement we see. The more rapid the benefit, the more behavioral reinforcement we see. So for example, like stimulants work instantly. So what happens from a patient perspective is patients will tell you stimulants work the best for me, nothing else works. And why do they say that? It's because they notice the benefit immediately. Whereas non-stimulant medication takes days or weeks to really kick in, so people don't notice it. But if you actually do studies where I take 100 people on stimulant medication, 100 people on non-stimulant medication, and I measure objectively how bad their ADHD is, let's say 3 months after they started medication, what I'm going to find is they're both equally effective. But the subjective experience of the two patients is going to be very, very different. The subjective experience is going to be any day I miss my medication with ADHD, with a stimulant, people notice it right away. So there isn't a difference in efficacy. What there is a difference in sort of noticing, or kind of like an awareness bias where you can really feel the difference of the medication. Whereas when you're on a slower acting medication, you don't quite feel it as much. So that's part of the reason why people say stimulants, quote unquote, work the best. I don't think the data suggests that they don't work substantially better than non-stimulants. It's just the difference is a lot more noticeable and therefore is much more likely to reinforce the behavior, right? So a lot of people are genuinely concerned about, am I going to be dependent on my ADHD medication? And the answer is maybe, right? So what I tend to see as a clinician is that a lot of people will find it very convenient to just take a medication every day because they don't have the time or the energy or wherewithal to learn organization, prioritization, whatever. Especially if we're talking about people who are students, right? So sometimes I'll get someone who's a sophomore who's coming in during midterms and they're like, you can teach me organization and planning, but in the 2 months it takes me to figure out how to use a calendar effectively, my midterms are going to be gone and I'll have failed them. So sometimes people will need medication because it's the easiest thing to do. Now, how dependent on it you become not just from a physiologic perspective, but we're talking like long term. Do you need to take a medication for the rest of your life? The answer is that depends. It depends on the severity of your ADHD. It depends on what other kinds of things you're willing to try. So we also know, for example, that meditation strengthens frontal lobe function. And the goal is going to be over time to like literally like reduce your mind's distractibility through practices like meditation. The more of that kind of stuff you do, the less dependent you're going to become on your medication. And the last thing about people sort of saying stimulants work best, well, I think they work fastest and they work most noticeably. But fastest and most noticeable does not technically mean best, but it oftentimes looks like best. Because think about it from the GP's perspective. When I give someone a non-stimulant medication, they come back in 2 weeks and they say the medication isn't working, I'm still having problems. Then as a general practitioner, I switch them from a non-stimulant to a stimulant. They call me the next day and they're like, this medication has changed my life. And so then as a GP, I don't blame the GP for, they can't stay experts in everything. I don't blame them, but they'll sort of say like, oh, okay, like, so it seems like stimulants work better. And then what happens as a GP is the next time someone comes in with ADHD, I just start them on the stimulant. And then I don't ever hear from them again, except when it's time for a refill. I ask them, how's the medication working? They say it's working great. So these kinds of biases, not really the GP's fault in a sense, right? Because there's very natural ways why GPs will get to that conclusion. Last thing that I kind of want to say is that if your doctor uses terms with you that you don't understand or terrify you, like they say like, oh yeah, you're dependent on this, by the way, that may mean something different to them than it does to you. And if your doctor says things that scare you, ask them to explain themselves. Be like, what do you mean by that? What does that mean? What are the implications of being dependent on ADHD medication? Is this a bad thing? Like, what do I do about it? Second thing is, by all means, get a second opinion. If a doctor is not talking to you enough, if they're not explaining things enough, then by all means, get a second opinion. Explain to them that you need more explanation. And also, like, by all means, go see a specialist. Got it? Okay. Questions? So someone's asking, how does one's life, Vlad2915 is asking, how does one's life change if they get diagnosed with ADHD? Chances are their life gets substantially better. So I know it's kind of a weird thing to say. Because remember, getting diagnosed with ADHD or not getting diagnosed, like you have the ADHD, whether it's diagnosed or not. It's affecting you, whether you have the ADHD or, whether you have the diagnosis or not. You've got ADHD either way. It's impairing your function, whether you have a diagnosis or don't have a diagnosis. The only thing that the diagnosis, hopefully the main thing that the diagnosis does is gives you the opportunity to do something about it, engage in treatment. Now, what we do know is that living a life of untreated ADHD leads to all kinds of problems. We've probably got a lecture that we're going to share with y'all in about a week or two about this, about the ADHD iceberg. But for example, we know that something like 50 to 70% of people with ADHD, let me think about this statistic. That sounds high even to me. I think I may be misquoting this, but if you look at the comorbidity of ADHD and depression, 3 to 5% of people with depression will grow up to later be diagnosed with ADHD. But of the people who have both, 50 to 70% of people with ADHD will also have depression later in life for that comorbid population. So what does that mean? Does that mean that if you've got ADHD, you have a 50% chance of getting depression? No. This is for people who have both. If you take that subset of people who already have both, what you see is that there is a causal relationship between ADHD leading to depression. And it doesn't go the other way. It's not just correlated. One causes the other. And why is that? It's because growing up with ADHD, especially untreated ADHD, shapes your life to be depressed later. So I'll give you all a simple example of this. Very fascinating study that found that kids with ADHD are less likely to be invited to birthday parties than neurotypical kids. Think about that for a second. So if I'm an ADHD kid, why does it mean I'm going to be less likely to be invited? It's because I don't pay attention. So all the other kids are talking about Pokemon cards, and I start randomly talking about something that's completely unrelated, and the kids all look at me like I'm weird because I'm highly distractible. I can't keep pace with the conversation. I also don't pay attention when they're talking to me, right? So over time, like, those kids aren't going to want to invite me to their birthday party. And then over time, if I stop getting invited to birthday parties, what does that mean for the development of my social skills? I don't get opportunities to, like, develop my social skills because I get invited less. Can't level up if you don't zone into where the fighting is, right? Like, you can't get any XP if you're not invited to the game. And so over time, kids with ADHD experience more social isolation and loneliness, rusty social skills, which in turn makes it harder for them to get promoted at work, because a lot of getting promoted at work has to do with social skills. And so what we tend to see with kids with ADHD, especially when it's undiagnosed and untreated, is that living a life of undiagnosed ADHD predisposes you to depression through features like underperformance of underperforming in an academic sense. So there's underachievement academically for kids with ADHD. There's lack of social opportunities, which leads to isolation and loneliness. There are all these different factors where you can almost, this is what we do in the lecture, that there's a whole lecture about this in Dr. K's Guide to ADHD and Doing Stuff, where you can map it out, how growing up with ADHD leads to particular factors which later in life lead to depression. Because what ADHD does is all of these factors over here are risk factors for depression later in life. So hopefully getting diagnosed changes your life for the better. So Scalicious is saying, I often hear people say that ADHD and other disorders are being overdiagnosed. Do you think that this is true? So I've said this before, I'll say it again. I think ADHD is both the most overdiagnosed and at the same time, the most underdiagnosed psychiatric illness. So you may ask a question, wait, how can something be overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed? What I mean by that is I think that ADHD is oftentimes missed in people who have it. So this is why we're seeing a lot more adult ADHD diagnosis. Why is that? It's because the diagnosis was missed when they were kids. Why was it missed when they were kids? Because the kids were super smart and built up compensatory mechanisms that allowed them to hide the ADHD. So when you see a smart kid with ADHD, oftentimes that kid won't get diagnosed. Because even though they can't pay attention, they can use brute force reasoning to figure out what is going on. So I'll give you all just a classic example. So a kid isn't paying attention in math class. My mind is wandering. I can't pay attention. Teacher says my name twice, and then suddenly I snap back to it. I can see the whole classroom is looking at me. Teacher is looking at me. And I can see that people are upset. Using my ADHD brain, which can quickly interpret information, I glance around the classroom. I see teacher is holding chalk. I see there are 4 problems on the chalkboard. 3 of them have answers. I look at the 4th problem that doesn't have an answer. I calculate very quickly because I have a high IQ. I say the answer. Teacher looks at me with suspicion because they were sure I wasn't paying attention, but I came up with the answer. They write the answer and then they move on. Kids with ADHD develop compensatory mechanisms. Leads to underdiagnosis of ADHD. At the same time, people overdiagnose ADHD. Parents are frustrated with their kids. Kids don't listen. All they ever want to do is watch the iPad. Parents never train attention in their kids. Anytime the kid is upset, anytime the kid is distracted, anytime my nanny doesn't show up, I'm guilty of this as well. Take the iPad, turn on the screen. Shatters the kid's attentional span. Increases emotional dysregulation. Kid has problems at school because I never sit down and read with them at home. Parents are like, kid doesn't listen because I don't have healthy boundaries at home. Kid gets diagnosed with ADHD. So it's both overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. Sounds like me? Oh, yeah. You betcha. Yeah, so Wise Guy 315 said something really good, which is girls get less hyperactive. That's true. So there's also ADHD is more common in boys than girls, but part of that could actually be underdiagnosis of girls. We're not entirely sure. Okay. Let's talk about, we have time for one more thing. So speaking of parents, so let's take a look at this post from a parent who's struggling to fix their son's gaming addiction. Because apparently their son is going to have to repeat the 9th grade. So heart goes out to them. This is a common struggle that parents deal with. So let's try to understand what's going on here. My son is 15 years old and he is diagnosed with ADHD and autism. He spends a lot of his time playing World of Warcraft, which his dad also plays and pays for the game. I put a strict schedule for him daily, which includes homework first before screen time and gaming is restricted to 2 hours per day until 8 p.m. when dinner is ready, and after which he showers, brushes his teeth, and goes to bed at 9:30. Question number 1, how much would you like to have this person as a mother if you were a gamer? Okay? Question number 2, for those of you that are like, oh my God, this sounds awful. How many of you don't want this kind of person as a mother, but wish your parents actually set firmer limits on you so that you were forced to develop good study habits? Study habits. Right? So we don't want this kind of person as a mother, and yet oftentimes as gamers, we blame our parents for not being stricter on us. For not giving us study habits, chat. Let's keep going. Trying to get a 15-year-old to shower and brush his teeth is a daily struggle. I didn't think much of it until I received complaints from his teachers about him not engaging with the class, misbehaving, not doing his schoolwork, etc. I also received a call from the school stating that his grades are so bad that he's going to stay in the 9th grade next year. I immediately told my husband to cancel the subscription and uninstall all of the games on the family computer. I set it up so that he cannot install anything on it without my password. I've not seen the subscription on our joint account. Question number 2, chat. How effective do you think this is going to be? Mom, uninstall all the games. Cancel all the subscriptions. Fix the problem. I'm going to fix my son's gaming addiction, right? I did not realize until later that he circumvented the boundaries I placed on him by lying and saying he has no homework so he can game. His teachers mentioned via email that he had homework. He snuck our old laptop in his room to play in the middle of the night past bedtime, and he has been cutting school to play the game in the library. I received a phone call later that day telling me he hasn't been in school. He was grounded immediately, and I took away his Switch, iPhone, and removed the keyboard and mouse for 2 weeks. And he is expected to be home right after school. He usually gets home around 3. And the punishment will be extended for another 2 weeks if he's not back by 3:30. Mom, cracking the whip. Oh my God, he has circumvented my rules. Let me impose further rules and more strict. For the most part, he complied. After realizing that he's going to repeat the 9th grade, the confiscation will be indefinite. Who wants this as a mom? I enrolled him in summer school and told him that he will get his stuff back if he passes summer school and have a minimum grade of C on all of his classes consistently next year. Ever since I confiscated his games in the computer, he has been snapping at me and giving me and his father a bad attitude. When I tell him to do chores, he barely finishes them and does it in the most passive-aggressive manner and half-assed. He's been getting into periodic temper tantrums and breaking things like a 2-year-old. He's become extremely disobedient. The last straw was when I found a 60-day subscription card in his room, which he used his allowance to pay for behind my back and sneaking into the library to play the game and sneaking a laptop I've already hid into his bedroom to play. So much hiding. Mom hid the laptop. Kid hides the laptop. I've stopped giving him money and I've asked husband to do the same. I'm at my wit's end with him and I have no idea what to do. I've tried finding other activities for him, but everything but that stupid game bores him. Even Netflix doesn't satisfy him. He is very easily bored, and when he's bored, he gets incredibly obnoxious. I've spoken with his doctors who increased his Adderall dose. Good, give him more stimulants. And gave him additional medication, but I'm only seeing a small difference. Parents, help. Definitely, this person needs help. So, before we start getting mad at mom, let's understand thing number one, which is that some of y'all had a mom like this who restricted your gaming and took things away, and y'all hated them for it. And when you fought, you won. You snuck things behind their back. So do we hate moms like this? While we're in this situation, yes. But you know what also happens? We blame moms like this for not being hard enough. Oh, mom, I was 15. You should have been more strict. You should have helped me study. You should have made me study. So parents are in a really tricky situation because we fight and chafe against them when they take things away from us. But if we get what we want, we blame the parents anyway for not being strict enough. It's really challenging. So what's the crux of the problem? How do we understand this situation from both the parent's perspective and the kid's perspective? And how do we start moving forward in this way? Thankfully, we have a lot of experience with this. We've been very successful at helping parents and their kids rebuild their relationship and overcome unhealthy video game habits. So the first thing, we're going to break this down for you, okay? There are 3 things to really understand here. The most important thing, how do I fix my son's gaming addiction? I'll say it now, I will say it again. No one can fix an addiction for someone else. You cannot cure an addiction. You cannot make someone else attain sobriety. Addiction has to be conquered by the person. So no matter how hard I want to, I can't cure my child of my child's gaming addiction, alcohol addiction, heroin addiction. There's a lot of stuff that I can do to facilitate sobriety. There's a lot of stuff that I can do to support sobriety, but I can't fix sobriety in someone else. And the basic problem that we've seen in this is our approach, is that right now it's parent versus child. They're both trying to outmaneuver each other. They're not on the same team. They're not working together. And so as long as your child is trying to circumvent you, this is going to happen. Circumvented boundaries. Circumvented boundaries. So what parents try to do is they try to control. And what kids try to do is circumvent. You can't force someone into being sober. Or even if you can, it'll only be for a little while. And the second they get an opportunity, they're going to circumvent you. This is a war that you can't win as a parent. So then the question kind of becomes, okay, well, like if I can't win the war, how on earth do I get my kid to stop playing video games? And that's where you've got to start by having conversations with them about like how the gaming is affecting them. Right? So this is where like there's an antagonistic relationship here. So the next thing that I would recommend to this parent is like talk to your child. What I'm seeing is a lot of limits being imposed. I'm seeing a lot of punishment, which makes sense. We're not saying that boundaries and punishments don't have a time and a place. But right now, y'all are fighting against each other. And any kind of punishment that you exhibit, they're going to be disobedient, they're going to be passive-aggressive, and they're going to try to circumvent it at every chance. How on earth are you ever going to win? And what does winning mean? Squashing your child into a compliance? That's going to just deal with, the more you squash your child, the more passive-aggressive stuff you're going to see, the more emotions you're going to see, the more dysregulation you're going to see, and the more that you try to find other things for him, and in his head, does he even want to listen? So you're trying to help, and he's swatting your help away because the relationship is antagonistic. I can guarantee you that there are other things that don't bore him. But right now, I want y'all to understand this. Like, let's think about this like a chess game. If mom is taking my games away and trying to find me another activity that makes it less that I can enjoy, if I agree that this activity is something I enjoy, what does that mean about mom's behavior? That justifies mom's behavior. That moves the game one step further away from me, right? Because if I'm having fun doing other stuff, then mom will never give me the game back. So even though I'm enjoying it, I'm actually lying to mom. I'm not even giving it a chance. This cannot work. Because the kid and the parent are not on the same team. You can cure a lot of things in other people. You can pull a bullet out of someone and patch them up, and then you're done. They don't need to do anything. When it comes to an addiction, it doesn't work. Other thing is, oftentimes parents, they try, right? They tried talking to the doctor. And the doctor upped the dose, but that doesn't fix the problem. So what do you do in this situation? Start with conversation. So if you want your kid to brush his teeth, does a 15-year-old who plays World of Warcraft every day understand why it's important to shower and brush their teeth every day? Right? Do they? I don't know. So talk to them about it, right? And this is where it's important to ask the kid what they want. This is a 15-year-old son. Chances are he's in puberty. And so this is a conversation about, hey, how do you feel about, let's assume, cisgendered, heteronormative for a moment. But how do you feel about dating? Would you want to date someone? What's your understanding of what kind of people, either boys or girls that you're attracted to, what would they want in their partner? What happens if you don't brush your teeth every day? Do you want to have a nice smile when you start dating? Right? And this is where all kinds of things can come up. Oh, I don't feel confident about dating. I feel so embarrassed. Then so you can ask them, okay, that sounds really challenging. Do you think that if your smile was good versus bad, would that make it easier or harder for you to deal with that embarrassment? And they're oh, it'd be so much harder if I couldn't smile. I'd want a nice smile. Okay, so what are you, how can we help you brush your teeth every day? Because that's how we get a nice smile. This is the kind of thing where some of y'all may be reading this and being ha, ADHD, autism, wow, person doesn't know hygiene. Maybe that's true. But my point is that whether that's true or not, you have to work with your kid to come up with goals that they are supporting you instead of fighting you. That's number one. Talk to your kid. So other questions to ask. I know it sounds kind of weird, but when you've got a 15-year-old, what's the point of school? I'm not hearing that the child actually understands what the point of school is. And we kind of assume, right? And this is where things get kind of tricky, especially if you've got a kid who's neurodivergent, is sometimes we have to explain things to them or have conversations with them, things that we never had to be taught ourselves. Right? So talk to the kid about what's the point of school. And this is where we got to talk to the kid, because it's 15, right? So we got to start talking about things like the future, this scary place called the future. What do you want your future to be like? Right? Do you want to go to college? Do you want to get a job? Do you want to be financially independent? What do you want to do? Is there a job that you think would be fun? What's your understanding of why we go to school? Next question. What's the point of games? What's so fun about this game and what's so boring about these other things? Why do we play games? What are they for? Right? And that's where it's kind of weird, but I just enjoy it. Yeah, but what is it for? So start engaging your child in these kinds of conversations. Now, is it going to be this simple? No, there are all kinds of other things we have to do next. But this is where there's not a shared understanding of what the goal is and why we're striving for it. And as long as your kid doesn't think that addiction is a problem and has no problem with failing out of the 9th grade and stuff like that, which he does, right? So we have evidence of that. He starts to listen a little bit more when he realizes he has to repeat the 9th grade. How do you feel about repeating the 9th grade? I feel terrible. How many times do you want to do it? You want to repeat the 9th grade once, twice, 3 times? What's your goal? You tell me. And how much do you want me to help you not repeat the 9th grade twice? Okay, so I'm willing to help. But this is what I need from you. This is what I'm going to do, and this is what you're going to do. So now we get to another problem. When I'm trying to fix my son's gaming addiction, who's bearing the responsibility of fixing the addiction? I am. Who has no responsibility? My kid. When I have all the responsibility and my kid has none of the responsibility, we're going to get situations like this. He's going to circumvent and lie because I'm the one who's responsible. It's my job to make sure he passes so he can do whatever he wants to, but at the end of the day, I'm the one who's responsible. So I have to crack down more and more and more and more and more to make sure the kid, because that's probably what's happened. Because when I was 14, right? So mom is struggling. So who's responsible for showering and brushing teeth? Mom is, not kid. That's why I struggle. When it doesn't get done, this is how you know who's responsible. When it doesn't get done, who stresses over it? That's the person who has responsibility. So if you want to fix this, you have to have shared responsibility. Then the parent naturally asks, how the F do I get my kid to take responsibility? And this is where the parent has done a couple of good things, right? So I would even start not by punitive, but creating a situation where gaming opens up depending on whether the kid does what they're supposed to do. It's not 2 hours per day until dinner is ready, after which you shower, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, okay, once you tell me what the targets are, we agree on what the targets are. It's going to be like C average in summer school. And once you hit those targets, you can play as much as you want. As long as you're hitting the target, you can play as much as you want. As long as you're going to bed on time, waking up on time, doing your chores and doing your schoolwork, you can play as much as you want. Or you can play 2 hours or 4 hours or whatever amount of restriction you want to do. But the key thing is that we want to incentivize the right behavior. Got to brush your teeth every day, got to shower every day. And then this is the kind of thing where what I would do is, okay, if you brush your teeth and shower and are in bed by 9:30, you get to play games tomorrow. You get the 2 hours tomorrow. This is the other big thing that parents don't realize. There's a lot of like simple stuff in terms of boundaries that never occurs to them. And one is that one day is the unit under which all privileges and punishments need to happen. You can actually reward behavior today. You can give people the reward tomorrow. And the cool thing is when you start giving the reward tomorrow, it actually helps someone with ADHD because it encourages their brain to plan into the future and restrict their impulses today. Now, this is what's really challenging about doing this as a parent is when you sort of say like, okay, no games tomorrow if they don't brush their teeth and, shower, whatever, go to bed by 9:30. And then like what happens when they don't do that, right? Like as a parent, your instinct is to go in and yell at them. We're not going to yell at them. You just pop your head in at 9:30. By the way, I noticed you haven't showered, haven't brushed, no games tomorrow. If you're not in bed by 10, it's lights out time. If you want to, you can have half an hour to shower and brush now. At 10 o'clock, it's going to be lights out. Your choice. So this is where parents really struggle, is they don't want to surrender that control. They don't want to surrender that responsibility. And you don't want to surrender it, which means your kid doesn't share that responsibility, which means the whole cycle continues. So this is the hard thing for parents, is that as you start sharing responsibility, outcomes can get worse for your kid in the short term. If they're actually responsible, you got to let them stumble. And parents don't want to do that. And then they wind up in this kind of situation where the parent is freaking out, making sure all the work gets done, making sure that you did your homework and studied for your test because we don't want to get an F. And then as you take the responsibility, the kid gives it up. So it's hard. But I think sharing responsibility is very important. And setting gaming as rewards for good behavior as opposed to you did bad, therefore I'm going to punish you. Because this sort of it means that the default is entitlement to the game. And as long as you don't screw up, I'll let go of the punishment. There's no reward. It's all about punishment and circumventing. And when you've got a punishing kind of system instead of a reward kind of system, what you're going to do is you're going to get people who circumvent the boundaries to avoid punishment. So have conversations, number one. Number two, reward-based systems. Share responsibility, but sharing responsibility means that you have to be able to tolerate a bad outcome. Actually, the first thing that we talked about, even more important than all the others, is that you can't fix an addiction all on your own. You need your son's help. The last thing that we've got to be very careful about, this is a very important tip. Got to get dad on board. He spends a lot of his time playing World of Warcraft, which his dad also plays and pays for the game. I'm not hearing dad anywhere in this conversation. Like, what the F? Dad needs to talk to him about, like, if dad is the one playing WoW and playing for the subscription, like, dad needs to sit down and have a conversation with his son. Hey, here's when it's acceptable to play to play WoW, and here's when it's unacceptable to play WoW. Right? Like, if the dad is the one who plays the game and, like, introduced the game and pays for the game, like, dad needs to be a part of the conversation. This is devastating for so many parents. When one parent is like, hey, this gaming is a problem, the other parent is like, they'll grow out of it. Or you've got divorce situations where dad lets unrestricted gaming or mom lets unrestricted gaming. Kid knows how to manipulate mom into, like, ignoring things, or mom is so loving and affectionate and, like, doesn't set appropriate boundaries. And then kid gets to play none. Then what's happened is the parents are tearing their hair out. Because the 2 weeks when the kid is with me, I'm very, very strict. Make sure they study every day. And the 2 weeks they're with the other parent, they let it all go to hell. And the kid is still skating by with C's because they don't study at all when they're at the other parent's house. So both parents need to be on the same page, whether y'all are divorced or not divorced. Whoever is in a caretaker role in the kid's life needs to be on the same page. How do I fix my son's gaming addiction? By having a conversation with your husband and making sure he is trying to do the same. By having a conversation with your son and make sure he is trying to do the same. Not saying that people should get divorced, but it's like, overcoming addiction is hard enough when everyone is on the same team. Infinitely harder when people are actively sabotaging your efforts. So it's tough. Like, this whole dynamic between parents and kids is getting worse. We want to blame the parents, and even as gamers, let's be honest, we sometimes blame them unfairly. Mom, I'm so mad at you for taking the game away. And then 5 years later, Mom, why did you give me the game? It's your fault that I don't have study habits and am failing out of college. Right? Parents can't win. So how do we approach this? It starts off by recognizing you can't fix an addiction for another human being. You got to get them on board. You cannot fix the addiction in spite of your son. If your son is trying to circumvent, be passive-aggressive, disobedient, and emotionally dysregulated at every turn, not going to work. Start with conversation. Use gaming as a reward. Enroll dad. Enroll also therapists and psychiatrists, because there's way more than, this is the other thing, when it comes to especially autism and ADHD, there's a lot of useful treatment that is not medication. It's behavioral treatment. It's organizational treatment. It's prioritization treatment. A good therapist who works with someone who's on the spectrum or someone who has ADHD will teach kids, will strengthen your child's executive skills. The goal is not restriction or compliance. The goal is to help your child grow into an adult where they take responsibility and start managing their own problems. Sometimes they need some explicit education in how to do that. And sometimes parents need some explicit education in how to deal with this. Why are so many parents struggling with this? It's because most of what we learn as parents, we get taught automatically by our parents in terms of our household. Do you pray together before you sit down and eat? What is dinner time like? How does laundry happen? How do you do chores? All this stuff we get taught automatically by our parents. How do you manage emotions? How do you manage rewards? What are the expectations around going to school, going to college? All that gets baked in because our parents taught it to us. Most of what we learn about parenting is automatic. The thing is, 40 years ago, games didn't exist. And so parents of this generation are struggling, overwhelmed, because this wasn't a part of my education. Because it's completely new. And as it's completely new, like, we don't know how to set boundaries around games. Like, I never had to set boundaries around, like, my parents never had to set boundaries around how much TV I watched, because when I was growing up, there were cartoons on Saturday morning, and there was crap like the news after 5 p.m., which I didn't want to watch anyway. They didn't have to set limits on me because there was only a limited amount of cartoons I could watch. And so the amount of limit setting and boundary setting that parents have to do now is way higher than they've ever had to do. Parents have never had, like, my parents didn't have to deal with I guess in a sense they did, billion-dollar corporations trying to addict me to stuff, which in that case was probably cigarettes. Right? But now it's like, it's games. So it's challenging, but it starts with can't do it all on your own. Got to get your kids help. Starts with conversations. Starts with sharing responsibility, letting your child stumble, and hopefully also includes the support of other caretakers as well as treatment professionals. You don't want to just throw medication at the problem. A lot of this stuff is behavioral. So teaching your kid how to respond, how to communicate, all that kind of stuff they can learn in therapy. So good luck, parents, because y'all are going to need it, because we're a tough bunch. Questions? How early can you start talking to your kids about it? I started at the age of 2. So I'll give you all a couple of quick tips. What do I do to help my kids? So I'll give you all a quick tip. How early can you start with kids? I started at the age of 2. So here's what I taught my kids. My goal is to teach restraint instead of restriction. So I'll ask my kids things. Like, when you watch, the first 15 minutes, how excited are you to watch? And after you've been watching an hour, how much fun is it? I'll ask them, right? During the first 15 minutes, pause for a second. Are you having a lot of fun? And 1 hour in, let's pause for a second. Are you having a lot of fun? 2 hours, are you having a lot of fun? This necessitates that I let them watch something for 2 hours. And then they'll say, no, I'm actually not having as much fun. And sometimes I'll even ask them, do you want to stop watching after an hour, or do you want to keep going? And as you raise awareness, kids will start to realize, after you've been watching for 2 hours, are you happy or are you cranky? Because a kid can realize, oh, I'm cranky. It's just about helping them become aware. Asking them after we spend a weekend away from screens, did you have a lot of fun this weekend? Did you miss screen time? When I ask you what you want to do, why do you say screen time first, even though you say you had more fun this weekend? How does that work? Why do you want screens? What do they do for you? I mean, we'll see, right? So, like, kids are doing okay for now, but maybe 5 years from now, they'll both be addicted, and this will be, terrible strategy. But generally speaking, it works really well. We've got to equip our children with understanding. Does it mean they get to watch as much as they want to? No. But when I do let them watch, I encourage them to think about what the impact of it is. And sometimes, like, we'll do that, right? Like, we'll be like, okay, what do you want to do tonight? You want to watch a movie? Fine. We can watch a movie. But then I'll set limits on them for the next day. I'll say,
We can watch a movie and you can stay up late, but you are not allowed to be cranky tomorrow. And then when they're cranky tomorrow, we'll have a conversation about it. Why are you cranky? Just because you're cranky doesn't mean that everyone else needs to do things differently. So unless you can regulate your emotions from this point forward, we're not going to watch movies before we go to sleep and stay up too late in the future. It's your choice. You show me that you can regulate the behavior and we'll continue the reward. And if they're able to regulate, great. Then I'll reward them. Close that loop with communication. Say, hey, you did a really good job regulating. Next weekend, we can try watching a movie again, and I want to see if you can regulate next time or even avoid the crankiness entirely. Right? It's all about closing that loop and having a lot of communication. That's the thing is like parents, we don't realize, first of all, we don't have time. Secondly, it's like hard to constantly be talking to your kids about computer usage or screen usage. But that's what it takes. I started at 2, but the questions get more sophisticated the older that they get. Kids are capable of restraint? Absolutely. Kids are very capable of restraint. Doubly so if you actually teach them how to restrain yourself, right? So I'll teach my kids how to meditate. We'll teach them restraint. Restraint can be taught. For those of you that are confused by that, y'all should definitely check out Dr. K's Guide to ADHD and Doing Stuff, because we'll teach you how to do stuff, which is a skill that you can learn. Most of us just stumble through it. Questions? Guide isn't out. So you can't check it out yet. Your kids meditate when they want to, is what I'll say. At what age? I started teaching them something like meditation before they were a year old and even under 2. So there are some focusing practices which you can teach a child like even before they're 2. Like I'll give them like, for example, I'll get a cup of warm water and I'll get a cup of cold water. So here's our meditation for the day, which is going to be, how do you teach a less than 2-year-old to focus their mind? So first you get their energy out, right? So like you do something physical so they're not like so fidgety and stuff. Then you get a cup of warm water and you get a cup of cold water. And then you tell them, put your hand in this cup and put your hand in this cup. And what is it? What do you feel? And even a 2-year-old can be like, this is warm. This is cold. And they'll like, you'll see them as you put their hands in the water. They'll like be wiggling around and as their hands go in the water, they'll like stop. And they'll like start to experiment. Let's start playing with it. And they'll focus their mind. Or you give them different things to smell. So another thing that I'll do is I'll tell my kid, close your eyes. Let's do smelling game. And then we'll give them different things to smell. And then like the kid will be still. You can say, okay, you can hold it yourself. So daddy's hand is open, grab the thing, and you can smell it yourself. They'll grab it. Okay, touch it. Tell me what you feel. So early on for kids, if you want a child to meditate, the key thing to understand is that children are very sensory creatures, right? So like early on in our brains, we're getting a ton of sensory stimuli. We're very attuned to our senses. So kids are very sensitive to things like sounds, right? They don't sleep if it's too noisy. They're very sensitive to things like taste. They're very exploratory. They'll put objects in their mouth when they're very young because they want to feel things. They want to touch everything. Don't touch that. It's poop. 1-year-old doesn't care, right? They want to touch everything. They want to taste everything. They want to see everything. They want to smell everything. So encourage that. Use those senses. So if you want to use some kind of sensory experience, you put some structure around it with enough sensory variety. So I'll give them like 5 different things to smell. And then what happens when they smell is, this is how we are going to teach also. We teach this in the guide. But pratyahara is sensory withdrawal or sensory restraint. So what we do in those kinds of situations is like we're using our sense organs to focus our mind. So when we chant a mantra, when we're using prayer beads, when we're doing Om chanting, when we're noticing the breath, we're using some kind of sensory organ, like our proprioception and noticing the breath, to focus our mind. And you can do the same thing with a kid. In some ways, it's even easier with a kid. They're more sensory dependent. So you can ask them to listen to something, right? They won't appreciate music, but like you can ask them, okay, I'm going to play a sound, like a jungle sound, like a jungle track for 5 minutes. And I want you to pay attention. Tell me how many different animals you hear. Anytime you hear an animal, you let me know. And then for 5 minutes, their mind is focused on listening. Their attention is focused. And it's curious, right? Oh, there's a tiger. And it's really great. Like they can learn very early. And then you can move more to formal meditation, which is what I'm teaching now. So now my kids are a little older. That's how you teach kids to meditate. What do you teach them about confrontations? We teach them a ton, right? If they've gotten there yet. Confrontations is like, that happens so early, man. We teach a girl. We teach a lot about confrontation. I mean, there's a lot. So for people asking Dr. K's Guide to Parenting, so let me just make sure that my kids turn out okay before I become an expert on parenting. We don't really know. I mean, we don't. The sad truth is that I've seen a lot of good parents end up with children who struggle. And I've seen a lot of bad parents end up with children who are amazing. And so that's kind of like that's the truth. Not everything that's wrong in a child's life is a parent's fault, especially as we become adults. What I tend to find is that we get the best outcomes when people are willing to take responsibility. So when you have parents who don't take any responsibility for how they screwed up their kids, that doesn't go well because then they never adjust their behavior and they never learn. And sometimes on the flip side, you'll have kids who blame their parents for everything and don't take responsibility for their own actions or their own choices. And then that doesn't end well. So it's all about shared responsibility. Okay, we're way over time today. So who are we going to raid? Let's figure that out. And then we will, I guess, finish up. Lapizia. I can't tell if this is, you want to raid Hassan or... I feel like a lot of people will say raid Hassan and we almost never do. So we're going to go ahead and raid Hassan today. Okay. I know that oftentimes we'll raid small streamers, but you know, Hassan's dope. So we'll see y'all on Wednesday. I think it's regular streaming schedule this week. We're not going to have our content creator stream on Thursday. I don't know exactly what we've got planned for the rest of the week, but at the end of the week, we've got our next community event, which hopefully is going to be great. Going to be very hard to pull off, is by far the most laborious on terms of what our community, team is doing. So hopefully, but it sounds super hype. So looking forward to it, and take care, everybody. We'll see y'all on Wednesday. Adios. 3, 2, 1. Bye-bye.